Let's begin with the good news. If you found the second half of that last course on configuring network services to be a bit of a mind-melting experience, well, I'm excited to report that the first half of this course on Active Directory is back to good old straight memorization. In fact, we begin here in this course on configuring account policies, which has everything to do with password policies and just a couple of group policy settings that you really have to lay into place in order to set up the policy for your Active Directory domain. We will begin with taking a look at local policies, but I'll spend only just a second there because I want to focus your attention on where these policies get configured using group policy. And mainly that's because that's where most organizations do it. They set a group policy and then they're done. The first three here on configuring password policy settings, account lockout policy settings, and Kerberos policy settings are the kind of thing that you do once probably per Active Directory domain, and you never look at it ever again. So we'll take a look at where these three items are in a sample group policy, that being our default domain policy. And then we'll configure them. I'll explain what the different settings are, which ones you should just never touch, and which ones you might want to adjust just a little bit, depending on what your security requirements are for your Active Directory environment. We have one quick look here at delegating password settings management as well, which curiously is the exact same process we went through back in the 7410 exam to delegate other responsibilities using the delegation of control wizard. But here it's specifically looking for a particular type of privilege that you can apply to a user or a group of users so that they can manage passwords and their password settings. The most important of the 5 tasks here is the last one, so definitely stick around for the last of these because it's here where we'll talk about creating and applying what are called password settings objects. Now these refer to a type of password control called fine-grained password policies, which were brought about in the Windows Server 2008 days. Now prior to that version, in the Windows world, if you had a need to configure a password policy, you could do so for the domain. But if you had the need to create a separate password policy for a different class of users, maybe your executives would rather change their password every 90 days instead of every 30, or maybe you'd prefer your service accounts to have a different policy entirely. Those accounts previous to Server 2008 and previous to fine-grained password policies, there really was no way to configure separate policies for different groups of users. Well, these days we can accomplish that with what are called password settings objects, or PSOs, and they are much easier, far easier to implement than they were in previous versions, because rather than having to dig into ADSI Edit, the Swiss Army knife of Active Directory, we can now build and manage our PSOs right within the Active Directory Administrative Console, the ADAC. So here for our final task, I'll show you in the ADAC where these PSOs get created and talk a bit about the precedence order for when they get applied.